me think. So I was a JTAC. I started out with having my fellow like JTAC friends and forward observers and stuff come on and everything like that. And it's kind of branched out. One of my more recent ones that's been pretty popular was Andrew Bustamante, who's a CIA guy. I saw him on Lex Friedman's podcast. I'm not sure if you've seen that one or not, but he was on there and I was like, oh, this guy's pretty cool. I'll check him out. Lex Friedman's an MIT AI kind of guy, and he just has all kinds of people on. So I had Andrew Bustamante come on recently. I had Hazard Lee, who's a F-16 and F-35 test pilot. Greg Coker, who is a 160th SOAR. So stuff like that. You know, have you heard of, do you know Jack Murphy?
Yeah. I do. Yeah.
Yeah, he's been on once also. I used to listen to his podcast back in the day. So that's kind of the vibe of it. I generally just overview. It's mostly military guys that I've had on. You're the first non-military. But it's completely, well, let's just start it now, man. This is, I'm excited to have you on. Because one, I studied journalism in school. I was journalism and advertising here at San Diego State University. And I've been wanting to have some combat correspondents come on because you guys look at the wars differently than we do because we're training up and, you know, we got a mission and we have a, whatever it is that we have to go take care of. You know, that's what our eyes are set on. And you guys are just, you know, a combat correspondent is supposed to be that third party kind of neutral observer, just watching what occurs, you know, not placing any judgment, not placing any kind of like recommendations or anything like that. And you're coming from a different background as well because you're a civilian, you know, so it's not like you've been through boot camp and all this other stuff. So I want to really get into one, you know, getting into that kind of work and the different things that you cover. But let's start at the beginning. Let's start like, normally I ask people why they join the military. You know, what did you end up studying in school? Why'd you go to college and what did you end up studying that led you down this path?
Yeah. So I grew up as like a military history nerd. I was really interested in the wars, especially Vietnam. I was like super obsessed with as a kid. So after, you know, and I always kind of thought as a kid, I would be a military historian. That was kind of my idea. But I was thinking about like long ago wars. And then, you know, 9/11 happened when I was in 8th grade and obviously stuff became a lot more present. And I just kind of got obsessed with sort of following the work of journalists who were covering Iraq and Afghanistan and trying to understand just as much as I could about what was going on there. I used to keep like these big maps in my room of like try and figure out where every battalion, you know, every combat arms battalion was deployed in the two theaters based on like embedded reporting and stuff.
Yeah.
And then I got to college and my initial thought was, well, I'm interested in the wars. Well, what do you do when you're interested in the wars and you want to see them? I joined ROTC because I thought, that just seemed like kind of the tried and true path. But then I had a bizarre opportunity come up to this was at the height of the embedding program. I mean, when this was 2006, 2007. My first Iraq trip wound up being 2007 when I was a 19-year-old between my freshman and sophomore years in college. I went over. I had a very strange opportunity to go and cover the summer of the surge, essentially for my college newspaper.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, really, really strange story. But so I went in the summer of 2007, and I thought, you know, because of the sort of the strange circumstances under which I went, I sort of figured they would treat me as like not a real journalist, you know, I'm like this kid who shows up. Yeah. I figured they'd keep me in the green zone or something. But, you know, I got there and this was the period of the Iraq War when there was the most embedded media in theater other than the initial invasion. Okay. And they just kind of were like, okay, here's another reporter. I mean, the public affairs staff at that MNFI in Baghdad, you know, where do you want to go? What units do you want to embed with? So because I kind of kept track of that stuff, I knew the answer. I was like, well, let's do 114 Cav on Haifa Street and 128 Infantry in West Rashid and 49 Infantry in Tarmiya. And so I just went out and started doing it and learned by doing. And that was my first trip. And then I went back to college, but during my sophomore year, a guy that I had met in Iraq on the first trip, a guy named Michael Gordon, he's now a sort of senior correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, but he spent 30 years at the New York Times, convinced me to take a year off school and start working for him as his research assistant on a book about the Iraq War that he was getting started on. It was actually his third book about the Iraq War. His fourth one just came out recently about the ISIS campaign. Nice. He's really one of my mentors and good friends, and I learned a lot from him. So I just started going back. I went back to Iraq in 2008 for a few months in the second half of 2008, kind of as the surge was winding down, and then started going to Afghanistan in 2009. And that's I just got really kind of fascinated by, especially Eastern Afghanistan. That just became kind of what I kept going back to.
That's so crazy. So you went to Iraq as a college student. How old were you when you went? You were a freshman?
19. So I was the same age as, a lot of these infantrymen in these units that I was covering, which I always remind people when people are like, oh, holy shit, you were 19 in Iraq. And I was like, well, so were a substantial portion of the, the guys in these units.
Yeah, but the preconditions to get there were a little different. You just kind of winged it and showed up. Well,
I showed up. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I think it's something I've learned as I've gotten older is like when you look at some of these jobs like combat correspondent or something like that, you wonder like, how do people get into this stuff? How do you even do it? It almost becomes one of those things where like when you talk to someone that does it, it's just like you just have to go do it, man. There's no like set path that's out there for people to just go research and do this one path. I mean, There's probably a general path, but everybody kind of figures out their own way to get there. It's on you, right?
I was very lucky in my timing because, embedding was a very accessible and cheap way to start covering the war, and kind of in a weird way, a safe way to cover the war. I mean, because I was, sharing the risks with the units that I was embedding with, but I've got the best bodyguards around, right? I mean, I'm always with a platoon of American infantrymen. Nobody's going to kidnap me and chop my head off. That wasn't the kind of risk that I was taking on, when I was young and starting out. And if you get wounded, there's an overhead that's gonna the same sort of infrastructure that evacuates American military casualties is gonna evacuate you. And so you're not paying for kind of stuff that I later on would, as I kind of expanded and went beyond embedding, you have to pay for interpreters and drivers and lodging and all this kind of stuff. Initially, I didn't have to do that because embedding provided this pathway. And you're only seeing the war from one lens that way, but it was a really important lens, and it's one that that it was really crucial to my kind of understanding the bigger picture of the war, was just understanding the smaller picture. I mean, just going around and just visiting different infantry companies in different interesting AOs and trying to understand what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like so. Are there two options really then to embed officially with the government, get in with the government and go through their process to become an embed, or just show up in Iraq and pay your own way and just cover the war independently? Or is that basically the two options there? Or, I mean...
Yeah, essentially, yes. And so, large news organizations, and I was a freelancer. I was not working for a large news organization.
Yeah.
Large news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, whatever, they have bureaus back in the day. I mean, they would have a bureau that they staffed all the time in Baghdad. Their own house out in East Baghdad that they lived at and had their security for and everything. So they had a full-time staff, most of whom were not covering it from an embedded perspective, right? I mean, they would periodically send people on embeds, but for them, that's one avenue out of many to cover the war. And most of what they're doing is independent. That independent stuff is much harder to do as a freelancer. I have wound up doing it as well, but embedding provided a really good avenue for freelancers to kind of get in on it, and also for small publications in the United States and abroad to get in on it. I mean, you think about the Idaho Statesman or some newspaper in a state that has a large National Guard mobilization, and it wanted to cover the experiences of that National Guard brigade when it was downrange. Embedding was a really valuable tool for that. And I think it's a real shame that sort of the Pentagon has, over successive presidential administrations, the Pentagon has essentially let embedding die. It doesn't really happen anymore.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, is that it doesn't seem like this is an ongoing thing. I mean, I didn't know if it was because the wars are just dying down. I mean,
it's a few different reasons. I mean, I remember the year that it really changed for me. I remember being in Afghanistan in 2013, and that was the first year that I kind of encountered resistance. And it became very clear that sort of, the days when you had the free run of things were over. And all of it, it used to be, you'd say, okay, I want to go to these 3 battalions, and they just line up the travel. That was sort of what public affairs was there for. And then once you were out there, you kind of just were on your own. You didn't have a public affairs escort unless you happened to be embedding with, CJSOTF Special Forces guys or something. Then you would have a public affairs escort, and it was a little more restrictive. And obviously you couldn't touch the JSOC task force. That wasn't part of the deal. But over time in 2013, it started to be, well, U.S. forces are stepping back into this advising role. And there was much more message control started kind of coming down the pipe of, well, actually, we don't want you to embed with that battalion. We're going to have you embed with this battalion because there's something we want you to see there. And it just became more and more and more restrictive as the years went on, to the point where, by 2017 or so, it just didn't really exist anymore. It was, there were very occasional sort of curated trips that would still be described as embeds, but really weren't in the same way. It would be, you get to spend a few days kind of with a public affairs guy looking over your shoulder, visiting a Green Beret team. Whereas a few years before, they just drop you off and, you'd have at it.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Guys that you embed with, they understand kind of, the restrictions you're operating under. And they generally I found guys to be very helpful to kind of what I was doing when I was embedding. I'd say that probably, I like to say that probably like at any given infantry platoon that I showed up at, probably 10% of guys were like really excited that I was there and had a lot of stories to tell. And another 10% of guys wanted just nothing to do with me off the bat. Just like they've had some bad experience with the media or have pre-existing notions about the media, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And then the remaining 80% of guys kind of just couldn't give a shit so long as you show that you're not a liability in some way, right? Mm-hmm. So long as you kind of, And then over time, they warm up to you. And they kind of realize that it's not your first time, and you might have some interesting things to tell them, and they share interesting things in return, and so on.
Yeah, that's I know from being on the military side of it, I understand why guys kind of maybe push away from any kind of media that embeds, or just they have a distrust, because I've literally been on operations or been involved in operations and seen it later reported on the news and it was incorrect, or it was out of context or whatever, and I was just like, dude, and that's the kind of stuff where, people lose trust. Now, that works the other way too, right? As an embed, you're there to get a story, and you don't necessarily want to become a propaganda piece for the government, only telling the story that they want to tell. How do you navigate that? Because obviously they're giving you probably more access than the average journalist, because they're allowing you to embed with troops. It sounds like at a lot of different levels, even these higher levels. How much are they really policing you of like what you're seeing? Or they're not editing anything that you guys are writing, but they're going to probably try to police what you're seeing. Is that accurate?
Changed through the years. If you go on a battlefield circulation with a general or something, obviously you're seeing kind of a curated version. Yeah. And it's probably being curated for the general as well as for you,
For sure.
If you, on the other hand, if you just go spend a few weeks with the infantry company somewhere and there's no public affairs person or anything, I think it was pretty uncurated.
Yeah.
You kind of you were living at the same little outpost with them. And there's not a whole lot that would go on that, just everybody didn't all know about who was living there. Mm-hmm. So I never, I rarely felt, when I was out with infantry units and cavalry units and so on, that anything was being hidden from me. There was caginess early on, always. But then, after a few days, generally it felt pretty, pretty real, just pretty normal. Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of it is these units, they would have, maybe they haven't had an embedded media person come through before, but they have random individual attachments and people who kind of come through. And so long as you can sort of handle yourself on patrol and you don't get in anyone's way when there's a firefight and you don't mm-hmm. make a problem, people are going to pretty much just kind of sort of accept you, and you're always going to be an outsider. Obviously, I don't mean kind of accept you as one of their own, but accept you in kind of the same way that they would accept, a lot of different kind of individual attachments who kind of would come and tag along with them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is really the biggest thing. It's like, hey, just don't become a liability and just don't lie. Don't make us look bad, kind of deal. And right. I think that's where a lot of people, that, like you mentioned, that mistrust in media, maybe from experience or just from bias of reading or hearing other people's opinions. But, I was talking to Justin Hazard Lee, who is a F-16 and F-35 test pilot and a YouTuber. And I was like, you are giving people like unprecedented access. You're flying around, you got GoPros and these jets and stuff like that, which years ago would have been unheard of, like having a video feed inside of a cockpit, of someone flying around. And we were having a discussion about, public affairs and how much can be talked about and stuff like that. And I mentioned to him, like, every time I ever got a brief from our public affairs officer before we'd have media come around, they never were like, don't talk about this, don't talk about it. It was always like, stay in your lane. If you're going to talk to someone, that's fine. Just talk about your job and what you know about. Don't try to, pontificate on the wars in general, or whatever. Like, don't try to talk about strategy and stuff that you're not the guy for that.
And that's exactly what, back in the heyday of embedding, and I mean, it's different now. But back in the heyday of embedding, that's what public affairs would tell guys before a reporter showed up, was just stay in your lane, assume that everything's on the record. And that's just how it is. And then, you could burn a bridge if you wanted to sort of trap some private and get him to say something inflammatory about the war or something. Mm-hmm. But that's just not, that's not what I was there to do. There's big differences between kind of print reporters and TV reporters and kind of what you're looking for, whether it's kind of a soundbite that looks good on camera versus you're just sort of there to absorb information and write a fairly short story afterward that pulls some of it together. But yeah, that's sort of what I always operated under, was what I want to hear from guys about is what they do, and what they know the most about. And what I don't want to hear from them about is what they don't do and don't know the most about.
Yeah, for sure. When you were getting ready to go on your first embed, or even any of your embeds, what kind of training, what kind of pre-planning are you doing? Obviously you're going into a military combat zone. I can't imagine you wandered in with nothing, or no kind of understanding of what you were about to do. So what did you do to lead up to it to get ready for these kind of trips?
Well, the first one I kind of was wandering into it with nothing, with no idea what to expect other than kind of what I had read. I read a lot about the wars and read other reporters' work and so on. But after the first trip, typically what I would do was I would plan ahead in the sense that I would get in touch with typically the battalion commanders of the units that I wanted to go embed with, because even though I wasn't going to spend all my time at battalion headquarters, that's sort of like a really, especially the way Afghanistan was,
Mm-hmm.
With kind of little fobs, maybe the battalion is at an airfield, but probably not even, probably brigade is at an airfield. And then battalion is kind of out in the hinterland at a smaller fob. And then all of its companies and platoons were scattered to the four winds at these little outposts. The battalion was kind of like a hub where you could learn a lot about what was going on in kind of a battalion AO. So I thought of the war kind of in battalion sized chunks. That's kind of the way that I thought about it. And so I would arrange a trip to do kind of, looking at the map, I want to see the Pech Valley. I want to see Paktika. I want to see Kunar. I want to see Sangin and Helmand, because those are the four places where I think something really interesting is going on this summer. Mm-hmm. So I would get in touch with those battalion commanders, tell them, hey, I'm going to be putting in these embed requests, so you can probably expect to see me at some point this summer. And then just sort of start a dialogue with them about kind of what was going on in their AOs, what to expect. And then obviously, beyond that, I brought over my body armor. I bought my insurance. That's kind of the extent of it.
What kind of body armor did you get?
Oh, I don't know what kind it was. In Iraq, I used to wear, I guess it was one of the old, I think they were called IOTVs. It was like a full vest that had the plates in it. And then when I went to Afghanistan, I switched over to a little, kind of a plate carrier type thing.
Okay.
And then I've still got my helmet up here that I always used to wear. But I guess I've still got the armor too. It's been a while though. I probably would need to get 2 new plates before I took it anywhere.
Does the government require you to have a certain level of protection when you come?
I don't know if it was. I'm trying to remember whether it was a requirement. It probably was. It probably was that it was 3+ or 4 whatever plates. But it wasn't. I had the luxury of I could wear my plate carrier with my front and back plates, and if I didn't feel like I wanted to wear side plates, which I never did, I didn't. So it was less of an encumbrance than than guys that are lugging stuff all around everywhere.
Well, yeah, a lot of Marines hated wearing those.
About my helmet, I make my living off my brain. It's very important to me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Did you? Obviously, you can't get involved in any kind of fighting that's going on, or you're not supposed to. You wouldn't
want me to either. I wouldn't add any value.
Yeah. So as a just in case, did you do any kind of weapons handling, training or anything like that? Did you want to be at least understand how to use the weapons in case it was a crazy situation?
I did. I know sort of how to use. I know how to fire a rifle, how to fire a pistol. I know how to do that kind of stuff. But no, I never thought that I was anywhere near a situation where that would become necessary. I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine the situation where the reporter tagging along with an infantry platoon is going to have is going to need to fight for his own survival.
Yeah, I mean, you hope not. You know, plan for the worst, right? Hope for the best. Yeah, man, it's just again such a crazy. I think it's really awesome. It was something when I got out of the Marines and I was looking at like my GI Bill options. I went to school. I started out as a business major, and I'm like, dude, fuck this. Like this, all roads point to corporate America. Here is what this feels like. So I switched over to journalism with and advertising. San Diego State University has like a program where you can do journalism and advertising, and I wanted the advertising as a backup because I'm sure, as you know, journalism's a tough living, you know, and if you're not making any money, you got to be able to do something. So I wanted advertising in there. But all of my like elective classes, I took these journalism classes, and I always wondered, like, and they never mentioned it. Like, how do you become this like embed? How do you become like, you know, to someone that may be graduating, you know, journalism school right now, and they're considering becoming an embed, what's the first step? Like, who do you even reach out to? How do you make it happen?
Well, it doesn't happen anymore, unfortunately.
Well, so you're saying now it's almost all just independent travel and independent funded trips. Like the government's not letting
the military really doesn't take embedded reporters anymore, other than very occasionally kind of. I mean, they'll take when the CENTCOM commander goes and does a trip around the region, some reporters will go with him and they'll visit some bases and stuff. But embedding is discontinued. Maybe on you could arrange it maybe in somewhere like the southwest border on the military mission down there. But yeah, Iraq, Afghanistan, the wars changed. I mean, sort of the Pentagon's version of it will be, well, hey, the wars changed and we're not doing the fighting anymore. The Iraqis and Afghans and Somalis and Yemenis and Syrians are doing the fighting. That's who you want to go cover. And you're not interested in our sort of training and advising that we're doing. That's boring. I'd say, well, no, I'm really interested in that. And I've always been interested in that. I always covered that aspect of it, even when I was out with regular infantry units and so on. I mean, I think really what it is it kind of, as the wars changed during the second term of the Obama administration, I think the administration kind of wanted to put the wars out of sight and out of mind. And it didn't want the American people thinking about them. And then a very easy way to accomplish that is to limit the battlefield coverage that's coming out. And so, you never saw out of Somalia or Syria the kind of embedded coverage that you saw for years in Iraq and Afghanistan. It just never happened.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's one thing that people don't realize. There's a lot going on in like Africa, but there's just no information about it. I mean, a few years ago when those Green Berets were killed in that ambush and stuff, people were like, wait, there's people in Africa? And it's like, yeah, man, that's an ongoing thing. Exactly.
I mean, and this is part of the role. I mean, if you've asked me, this is part of the role that journalists play, is informing the public of what our men and women in uniform are up to in places where they put their lives at risk overseas. I mean, it's not as though U.S. forces in Niger and other places in Africa were sort of there without anybody knowing about it. I mean, the relevant congressional committees are read in and everything, but it's not in the public mind for sure. in the same way. And, maybe that's by design. In some cases, it's probably appropriate. But in general, I think kind of the more you let journalists out to kind of see what troops are doing on the front line, especially if you're dealing with people who cover this as their beat, as their job, and who speak the language and so on, you're going to have fewer misunderstandings rather than more of them. People are going to understand what these forces are doing in the places where they're deployed. And I think that's important for people to kind of decide whether we think these are sort of worthwhile endeavors or not.
So, in this stage of reality, I guess, you're talking about no embeds. Let's say you do want to go cover forces in Niger and you're not going to get, official support from the government to do so. What does your process look like to make that happen? I mean, obviously, I assume you start with an end goal. Hey, I want to be in Niger covering the forces, and then work backwards, or how do you do that?
I mean, you just can't do it. The Pentagon will never allow it. You can't cover forces, in the field in places like AFRICOM. You have to what you can do is cover it after the fact. Talk to guys kind of informally after they come home. Try to piece together things a little after they're happening. So I mean, I've never set foot in Somalia or Niger. I'm hoping to soon for a new project that I'm getting started on, a new book project. But again, it'll be all after the fact. It'll be trying to go talk to members of Nigerian and Somali surrogate units that used to work with U.S. Special Operations Forces, and kind of trying to document the recent past.
Okay.
That's sort of going to be the tack, and because that's sort of what I have grown into over time. Is I started out sort of just covering the here and now on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And then the more I did it, the more I felt like there just was a lot of stuff that I wasn't understanding. I didn't understand, kind of the history of how things had gotten that way in the years, preceding my visit. The more I wanted to kind of just like try and get the other perspectives besides the embedded perspective, and sort of try to string them together into a narrative. So, I wound up covering the Pentagon for Politico for a few years while I was doing this. But I started writing a book about 10 years ago that finally came out last year, where the idea of which was to zoom in on one small but eventful area of Afghanistan. And I chose the Pech Valley in Kunar and Nuristan, and try and just, reconstruct everything that had happened there. Go back to the beginning and play it forward from there. Because, the Pech was a place that I first went to in 2010. And it was a place, there was an infantry battalion from the 101st Airborne was living out in this valley. It was clear that a lot of stuff had happened in this place leading up to 2010. This is where the Korengal Valley is. It's where the Battle of Wanat happened in the Waigal Valley. These are tributaries of the Pech. And so by 2010, this is the summer of the surge. And, I was traveling around eastern and southern Afghanistan, embedding with different, units. And typically the battalion commanders, when you show up, they kind of tout all the progress they are making or think they're making or want you to believe they're making, all the new kilometers of road they're getting paved, all the new outposts they've built, all the numbers of A&A that they've gotten trained, all this kind of stuff. And, kind of telling you how much better things are going to be by the time they hand things off to the next battalion commander. And in the Pech, I just got a totally different read. It was very clear that U.S. forces had kind of reached a counterinsurgency stalemate there. There were not, kind of incremental gains accruing anymore. And the battalion commander was very upfront about it. He was, one of the quotes that I remember him saying was, "I came in here looking for a counterinsurgency victory, but here in the Pech Valley, there's no such thing." And that's just, that was a surprising thing to hear from a battalion commander in the summer of the surge in 2010.
For sure. That's pretty blunt.
He was very blunt, and he was trying to make the case to pull out, that things were done there. We had worn out our welcome, which was my observation as well. As you go around this valley, and U.S. troops are driving around in their MRAPs, kind of commuting between their different outposts. They go out on foot patrols occasionally. Well, not occasionally. They pretty regularly going out on foot patrols and everything. But it was very clear that the people in this valley were not into it. They were just trying to live with minimal contact with either of the two fighting sides, right? I very clearly remember this event where I was out on a patrol in the Pech west of Fob Blessing, which was the battalion headquarters, with there's a company commander in one of his platoons, and we're going out and visiting this village to kind of check on it, just do this sort of presence patrol, key leader engagement type thing. And as the company commander is sitting down with sort of the village Shura chief to start, one of his young infantrymen on the perimeter shoots a dog that comes at him. He's scared of the dog. The dog could be rabid, whatever. And, it's maybe it would have been better to throw a rock at it. I don't know. But the point, but it was a reasonable thing to do. But you could see the tenor of the little meeting that the company commander is having with the Shura leader changes. And the Shura leader immediately goes into this negotiating mode. He's like, "Oh, you killed my dog. Worst thing you could have done. I would rather that you had killed my wife and children. Yeah. So the company commander starts negotiating, well, how much compensation do you want or whatever? And the guy's going to take the money, but he's not in it. He was not in it for the money. What he wanted was, he wanted a promise not to bring the MRAPs near the village, because the Taliban were getting the impression that they were collaborators and were too close to the Americans. Because the Taliban are coming down every night to do their own presence patrol and key leader engagement. And talk to them about the Americans and say, hey, don't support those guys. And these people are just stuck in the middle. They're dealing with U.S. troops in the A&A during the day. They're dealing with the Taliban during the night. And by this point in the war, it's pretty clear to them that it's a lose-lose for the most part. And so I wanted to understand kind of how things got that way. And, another example, you go to Kopp, Michigan, at the mouth of the Korengal Valley in the Pech, and I'd never seen so much artillery being fired in my life. I mean, it was just an unbelievable amount of artillery and mortars and JDAMs being dropped and everything. It was just unreal. I mean, probably, a couple weeks in the Pech Valley in the summer of 2010, saw more artillery and mortars being fired than in all the other embeds I ever did, everywhere else combined in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yet there's this weird kind of phenomenon where, I mean, Cop, Michigan is, it's this little concrete fortress, right? It's to be the T-walls and everything, and it's sucking down recoilless rifles and RPGs and Dishka fire all day long, 3 or 4 times a day. And it's not as though it's not dangerous. I mean, there were guys that were wounded, during my visit. But also it was clear that this is not how it had always been, right? Like, this has been built up into this little fortress where kind of everybody, it's all down to kind of a science, right? And a battle drill. So, people are not, on the American side, it's not, guys are not dying for the most part in these attacks because they sort of have battened down the hatches with this outpost and it's so heavily fortified. And you really got the pretty distinct impression that up in the hills, not very many of the Taliban were dying either, because they know exactly how long it's going to take for those first mortar shells to start falling, and then exactly how long after that the 155 is going to start hitting, and exactly how long it's going to be until Kiowas show up. And so you kind of got the impression that both sides were kind of doing this act, and they're gaining combat experience by doing it. But that really who's kind of suffering is just the people in the middle, the people who live in the villages where the short rounds fall from both sides. The people who, the base workers who have to go back and forth between this outpost where they're sucking down rounds and the village where the Taliban's going to threaten them. And I wanted to understand how it got this way, because, by 2010 in the Pech Valley, if you asked the company commander or company first sergeant or even the interpreter at a place like Cop, Michigan, or Able, Maine, or Honaker Miracle in the Pech Valley, hey, who built this outpost? How did it get here? They just didn't know. Because, well, it's not in their job description to know. There's no reason that they should know that. But it just was so far into this kind of, even though it's only 10 years, less than a decade into the war, it's so far into this kind of past of rotations and cycles that the answer would be, well, it was here when the company commander before me got here. Pretty sure it was here when the company commander before that got here. Guess it's always been here, And that doesn't mean that these guys don't know what their kind of task and purpose of what they're doing is. They do. But they don't know what the original purpose of the outpost was, who built it, what the circumstances were. And so, if you're living at Cop, Michigan in 2010, you're a corporal or a private or sergeant in the company that's living there. I think it was really easy to kind of imagine, well, who would have built an outpost in this fishbowl valley? Like who could possibly have done this? It must have been somebody who's either not in their right mind or had never been here or just was trying to get American soldiers killed, just some moron, right? But that's not actually what happened, right? I mean, every one of these outposts was established by people with good intentions, working on the information that they had in the context that they had it in. And so that was what I wanted to understand was just, well, there's about a dozen outposts up in this part of the world, this sort of battalion-sized AO. What's the backstory with them? How did they get here? Who built them and why? And so that's what I tried to do with this book project was, I had sort of had my own firsthand glimpse of the Pech, and that was interesting. But I wasn't interested in writing about that, really. I mean, what I was interested in doing was kind of unspooling the story and going back and trying to recount from the very beginning, how did it get this way? By talking to guys from every unit that passed through there. Every infantry company, every ODA, every JSOC element, going back to the CIA teams that established the place. And I sort of had a hunch at the beginning that you would find, these basically the counterinsurgency kind of conventional war and the SOF OGA counterterrorism war are wrapped up together in a way that wasn't totally obvious when you're embedding, but I didn't understand the details of it, and that's what I wanted to understand, and that's what you could only do in retrospect. Was, as time passes, go and talk to people, who were there at the beginning, who were in the types of organizations that you don't have access to when you're embedded, and try and weave those stories together. And then also talk to Afghans who live there, talk to local district officials, talk especially to interpreters who have this really unique position, kind of liaising between the units that live there and the people who live there. Yeah. And just try and weave these stories together. And, what I couldn't do was talk to the Taliban. So, that's the perspective that's most missing from the book, which is unfortunate. I mean, I got it to the extent that I could through talking to kind of low-level former Taliban fighters, through interrogation reports, stuff like that. More and more, I think that will be possible to capture. They have won, and a lot of them are happy to talk about it now. But I did the best that I could, kind of with the people that I had access to on the American side and the government side and just the people who lived there.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously you didn't talk to the Taliban because this was in 2010 or whatever, and really that wasn't possible, right?
Not at the time. I mean, over time, I was able to talk to sort of some guys who had, who had been low level Talibs who had fought in a couple battles or something.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to them about sort of why they had joined, stuff like that. But I was not talking to Taliban commanders. That wasn't possible at the time. It's only in the past couple years that the Taliban have sort of started to open up to Western press.
I was talking, I think it might have been on the last podcast, I can't remember. I was like, dude, I've had multiple like Iraqi and Afghan former fighters comment on my videos and stuff and be like, oh, I remember that. I was there, I was at this battle or whatever. And I'm like, that's kind of fucked up. And I'm like, maybe I could interview one of them, but is that, it's like that weird, like maybe I could, but should I kind of deal, and I obviously some people wouldn't like that. But some people would appreciate it, but I think it would be interesting to get a perspective from those guys of why Afghanistan was so important to them as well. Another thing too, you probably have some insight on this too, if you're like talking to villagers and stuff. Something we ran into a lot was these, not necessarily fighters, but people that were pressed into service, I guess, by the Taliban. Like, hey, you're going to go put in this IED or maybe your family, gets killed or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. How many people did you run into that were like, look, man, I had to go and put in an IED, but I didn't want to. It was like, I have to or I'm going to get killed kind of situation. Was that like a thing there? Because it feels like they had to have some kind of support within the villages, right? Even if it wasn't, necessarily support that the village wanted to give.
Right. And even the people, the village that I'm talking about, even the people in that village who are kind of, they're stuck with the Taliban in a way that they're not stuck with the United States. Right.
Yeah, for sure.
And they have cousins and the sons of friends who they know are up in the hills in the Taliban. Everybody knows people in the Taliban just the same way that everybody knew people in the police and the army. This was a civil conflict and they were totally intertwined. Every ANA battalion commander had his enemy counterpart on speed dial. Every police district chief, had the number saved of sort of his counterpart in the hills. That's just the kind of war it was. It wasn't for us, for the American side, but for the Afghan side, it was. It's not a 20-year war for them. It was a 40-year war. That goes back to 1978 and is really complicated. And there's a lot of switching of sides that happened. Sure. Including during the 20 years that we were there, a lot of switching of sides that happened. People who opposed the Taliban before 2001, but who joined the Taliban post 2001 because of, the story that comes out in the story of Kunar in the Pech Valley is one of, basically, people are willing to forgive and forget. Well, not forget. People are willing to forgive good faith mistakes for a while. But when one unit after another all rotate in and they all have the same learning curve and it's really dangerous. The first couple weeks in theater are dangerous for troops. We know that. Those first couple weeks that a unit is in theater, those are dangerous for people who live there too. Mm-hmm. As units kind of figure out, well, what do we really need to be afraid of? This isn't a place that has VBIDs. Maybe we don't need to be so touchy at the vehicle, VCPs or whatever. And it was often kind of during those initial weeks that things would go wrong, that people would be killed by mistake. And so, over time, you're not willing to forgive and forget anymore, right? Over time, you just don't want to talk to these people anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's very often the story. And, kind of the low-level guys that I talked to who described having participated in battles like, the battles in the Weigel and so on. For them, typically the reason they did it was because someone they knew had been killed by mistake by American forces.
Okay. That's not surprising, to be honest,
Yeah. And, it's just, and, often I knew exactly the incident they were talking about, right? Because I've also heard it from the American perspective. I know how it went down from the American perspective. I've read the 15-6. I've talked to the guys who were involved. But very often that's what it was. A guy, there's a guy who he and his brother joined because they had a mentally disabled brother who wandered too close to the perimeter of the ranch house outpost in the Weigel and he was shot. And that's the kind of thing that drive people over. That's not everyone, but in the story of Kunar and Nuristan, where the Taliban was not strong before 2001. I mean, the Taliban is a southern and southeastern movement, right? A lot of Kunar and Nuristan. A lot of these people are Salafis who really opposed the Taliban, fought against the Taliban before 2001, but who wind up joining and making common cause with the Taliban over time. As they get frustrated with the Americans, and also as they get frustrated with the U.S.-backed government that they see as predatory and corrupt, which is not a wrong impression that they have over time. And often that's really who they hated was, not so much the Americans, who they kind of knew were in a tough spot, and operating in a place that they didn't really understand, but kind of the Afghans who were pulling the strings behind the Americans in a lot of cases, because that's one of the big stories that comes through. It's really easy, unfortunately, to manipulate foreigners who are living in your neighborhood and are scared all the time, right? The first Green Beret and CIA teams that showed up in Kunar in 2002, I mean, they had to figure out who to deal with, who they were going to use as informants, who was going to supply them with militias and so on. And they had to make those decisions, in the moment. They didn't have, a long time to sit around and kind of think about it.
Yeah.
But what winds up happening is you get sucked into local disputes. You get used on one side or another of a dispute over water rights, or a longstanding feud that nobody remembers where it began, or a commercial dispute over timber. I mean, and that's how the whole Korengal happens, is because of timber. And because basically both the United States and the Taliban are brought in as opposing sides of muscle in a timber war in the Korengal Valley. And the Americans don't know that they're being used for that purpose. Eventually they figure it out. But by then it's kind of too late.
This is actually the first time I've heard that. That's
Oh yeah, no, I'm happy to tell you the story of the sort of the timber situation, but it's one of my, I think it's totally fascinating. It took me a really long time to kind of unspool. But another example, I'll give you another example. I mean, in the Weigel Valley north of the Pech, when U.S. forces showed up there in 2006 and started building outposts, guys from 10th Mountain, they didn't understand the history that the United States already had in the Weigel Valley from 2003, which is that in 2003, there was a CIA-directed airstrike in the Weigel Valley that was botched very badly, and that killed a number of people, about 6 or 7 people, mostly women and children, from a very pro-government family. And, I tell this story in the book. It's in chapter 2 of the book, which is about Operation Winter Strike, where a bunch of, a couple battalions of Rangers, basically half the Ranger regiment, surge up into Nuristan trying to pick up bin Laden's trail in 2003. But at the same time that they're doing that, the CIA is also trying to pick up bin Laden's trail in kind of a parallel effort. And essentially the CIA gets played by 2 of its local sources who get them to do an airstrike against someone who they have a grudge against. Mm-hmm. And this creates a lot of ill will in the valley, right? As it would if it happened in your home. But then the American troops who go there 3 years later, they don't know about it. When they move up there and start building outposts, nobody has told them that this event has happened, 3 years earlier, because it happened on the CIA side of the house.
Yeah.
And it's secret, and but it's basically like this kind of booby trap that's sort of waiting for them to go up there and kind of handicaps them from the get-go.
Yeah, that's crazy. I'm not surprised by that, honestly. I think we heard a lot of stories out of the early days of Iraq, during the invasion of Iraq was the same way. It was, having locals supposedly help them point out terrorists, but it turns out some of them were just people they owed money to or something like that.
Or even, if you look at the big picture in Iraq, the Bush administration was played by Ahmed Chalabi. He was, at the highest levels of U.S. government, there was a guy who was saying, hey, I'm the guy you want to work with. I'm your willing partner who's going to transform this place, but who at the same time is also talking to the Iranians and winds up being the Iranians' kind of big in to Iraq. And so that's happening at every level, right? It's happening at the level of, individual guys that soft teams are talking to, mm-hmm. and who the members of their surrogate forces are and who their interpreters are. Over the years, you get kind of a more and more sophisticated process for choosing interpreters. But at the beginning, it's just like, well, this is the English-speaking son of the guy who lives here.
Yeah.
And this is the same guy who's also supplying the militia and who's also giving you tips and saying you need to hit this house and that house and that house because they all sheltered Al-Qaeda, right? And you're just kind of taking his word for it in a lot of cases in the early days. One Kunari guy put it to me, by the end of 2002, I mean, so really early by, the way we think about it. But by the end of 2002, people in Kunar were wondering who is whose proxy, right? I mean, who is leading who around by the nose in this province? Are kind of the Americans using kind of these local surrogates, Malik Zareen, guys like this, or are those guys using the Americans to kind of go and change the balance of power in the place?
I mean, are you surprised by this though? By the Americans' inability to, I guess, properly target early on? Because what do? If you're in an invading force like that, you really are reliant on that human intelligence at first, just because you don't know anything about the area, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like catch-22, because it's like you have to do something and you have to start somewhere. But
right. I mean, I think that's
tough.
maybe the assumption. The kind of question is that we have to do something, right? I mean, you see a period of time, look at 2004 in the Pech Valley, in the year after this airstrike that I was talking about. You get two different Green Beret teams that go out and live in the Pech, one after the other. There's a 19th group team that goes and lives in the Pech for 6 months, and they build up the base that becomes known as Camp Blessing, and they build up kind of a local militia force of surrogates. And then there's a third group team that comes in and replaces them. And these two teams, they come from the same schoolhouse and pipeline and everything. And all the 19th group guys, they were in the active duty groups before that and everything. It's the same kind of people who've gone through all the same kind of training, but they could not have taken more different approaches during their 6 months that they had the Pech. And you particularly see this with the Korengal, where the initial team, the 19th group team, I mean, they have informants telling them, hey, you got to get up in the Korengal. That's where the bad guys are. You got to get up there. You got to do something about them. This is enemy central. But the 19th group team is sort of, I think, has the wisdom and perspective to question this, to say, we don't need to act on every tip. We're here for a reason. The reason isn't to crush every cockroach in the neighborhood. The reason is to create a little ink bubble of pro-government security within like a kilometer of the village of Nangalam, the district center. And, if people are giving us, tips and stuff out beyond that, there's risk in that. Something's going on in the Korengal regarding timber. We don't know what it is. It sounds complicated, sounds messy. We don't need to get involved in that. Third group team comes in and they essentially have the opposite approach. People are telling them to go into the Korengal, so they go into the Korengal because they want to get in fights. And they're a very sort of kinetic focused team. They're not super interested in the nuances of kind of who is Taliban versus who is Haig versus who is Al-Qaeda. They kind of see it all as one kind of enemy mass. And as a result of that approach, they wind up really increasing the size of that enemy mass by making a lot of enemies. And by getting sucked into this Korengal timber war, because the people who are giving them these tips are Safis down in the Pech, who are in commercial disputes with the Korengalis over timber, and who are trying to kind of weaponize the U.S. military presence against their enemies, the Korengalis, and that's exactly what winds up happening. And but there was this initial team though that sort of had the wisdom not to get sucked in, and I think it's not a coincidence that these guys who had that wisdom were older guys. Guys who already had their active duty Green Beret time, just guys who weren't who didn't have anything to prove, kind of.
Yeah, and you got to vet the intelligence and stuff like that. You don't want to just take single source intelligence and turn that into something actionable. It's it's such a. I mean, it's not. It shouldn't be surprising. I mean, especially for people. Our intel community should be the people that really know about this and I guess put that information down to the battalion levels and below and be like, hey, this is the history of this area. This is what you need to be aware of and why, which I don't really think we got. I can't ever remember. I'm sure the battalion commander got some kind of briefing on the battalion history or the history of the area and stuff like that. But it was probably mostly recaps of major battles and stuff rather than the local, like, atmospherics, and that's not to say that the intel guys didn't have that information. They may have, but I don't know. It's just I don't know, man. It's such a tough thing,
A lot gets lost during those transitions, during those like 2-week overlap periods, right? Because there's a lot to kind of download during those 2 weeks. And I mean, and what what you're going to focus on is the short-term stuff, the stuff that's going to keep you alive tomorrow.
For sure.
Right. And so there's a lot that gets lost. And there's a lot of, especially in northeastern Afghanistan, where the CIA always had this very, intense presence that was kind of whispering in the military's ear at the kind of brigade and battalion level. There's a lot of that kind of communication that gets lost when the new unit comes in and doesn't know kind of what the CIA base chief had told the previous battalion commander about, what the sort of the counterterrorism benefit to the counterinsurgency that we're doing up here is, that kind of thing. Often what happened in the case of the Pech Valley is 2006. The CIA is whispering in the ear of then Colonel McNicholson, who winds up being the 4-star in Afghanistan later, and saying to him, hey, if you're going to be doing this kind of outpost-centric coin somewhere in the Afghan East, it would be helpful for us if you could do it up in Kunar and Nuristan, because we have cross-border targets in neighboring areas of Pakistan, Chitral and Bajar, and if you build outposts up there, those could kind of serve as kind of collection lily pads for us as well. But then this never really pans out. The agency doesn't actually kind of put full-time people at any of these bases or anything. So it never lives up to that promise. Mm-hmm. And then when the next brigade rotates in and inherits this whole network of outposts that were built sort of partially for that reason, they hear a little bit about it from the guys that they're replacing, but they're not sold on it. I think in some cases appropriately so. And they start to scale back. But one of the things that you see over the years is it is a lot harder to unbuild outposts than it is to build them, especially after they've been there a few years. Mm-hmm. Because what began as a few Humvees and some concertina wire and some tents, over a few years, it's a whole little fortress. It's got it's got these connexes, and it's got treadmills, and it's got containers full of shit and all kinds of stuff. And to unbuild that outpost, to remove it, especially once you're looking at kind of air only or air centric outposts like in the Korengal and the Weigel, how do you do that? It requires the same pool primarily of Chinooks. That becomes kind of the limiting factor. It requires those same helicopters that every other battalion in the East is clamoring for their air assault operations. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes this kind of competition for resources between big named operations and kind of and outpost retrogrades. Yeah. And it's very hard often to kind of prioritize that outpost retrograde if you're sitting at, division headquarters, because that's like, so often it winds up not happening for far too long, far too long. So it's not until kind of a year after guys have realized we're not accomplishing anything in this outpost that they're actually able to retrograde from that outpost. And in the meantime, more people have died.
And it's not just like, oh, we're going to pull out of here and move these guys to a different camp or whatever. Because of the bureaucracy of the military, there's like a whole decertification process that has to occur. Like there's an inspection of where like latrines were and, all this stuff that's kind of like any other country would laugh at, but we have like a whole process because we don't want to leave it. We wanted to leave it a better place than what, we
there's also, there's a difference between you're just leaving an outpost and like destroying it and, turning it into rubble versus you're turning it over to the ANA.
Yeah.
And this winds up getting the U.S. military in a lot of trouble in 2011 when it leaves the Pech. This battalion commander that I described in 2010, he succeeds. He and his chain of command at the 101st, they eventually, after many months of kind of back and forth and trying, they sell ISAF on, we don't need to be in the Pech Valley anymore. This place is having diminishing returns. It's a resource suck. It's not worth being here. The analogy that the brigade commander used to use was, there's this idea of the counterinsurgency ink blot strategy, right? Yeah. And his thing was, look, he's saying I'm not saying that counterinsurgency ink blot strategy doesn't work in some places, but this place here, this isn't paper that ink soaks into. This is plastic, and the ink blots aren't growing. Mm-hmm. But so they leave, but there's this whole problem because essentially, the U.S. military has over time, at this point, it's lost, over 100 guys in this valley and its tributaries. It's a bunch of helicopters have crashed and been shot down under various circumstances. And so for the U.S. military, this place is like, it's clear why we're done with this place. But on the Afghan side, on the Afghan government side, they see a lot of political value in the Pech Valley, in part because up until now, they haven't been the ones fighting for it, right? They have allowed the United States to underwrite this effort and kind of do the heavy lifting in this effort. And so the Afghan government, in the person of actually President Karzai himself, when the U.S. military pulls out of the Pech in 2011, they say, well, no, we're staying. And this is, horrifying news to the Afghan soldiers who were at Fob Blessing and the bases in the Pech. Sure. Yeah. Who were like, well, are you shitting me, right? Because there's been years up to this point, this is kind of surge era. I mean, there are trainers and advisors out there, but they're not the main effort. I mean, this is what I used to see all the time was it was a big battalion war in the surge. It was about, Afghans would get kind of dragged along as an afterthought. And you can understand why, right? It's like if you're a tactical leader, a team leader, a squad leader, platoon sergeant, platoon leader, company first sergeant, there's not a huge amount of value often that's coming from, to your immediate needs from having these Afghan forces kind of dragged along on patrol who are, very amateurish and untrained and so on. Mm-hmm. But as long as you keep doing that and you're just sort of dragging them around and keeping them in the dark, they're never going to be ready. Yeah. Right. And so this, and they're relying on the U.S. for everything. They're relying on the U.S. in the Pech for not only for air support and so on, but just for very basic logistical things. And so what winds up happening is the government forces this battalion to stay there that's nowhere near equipped for it. And it starts to fall apart as soon as it's left on its own. And so this draws the U.S. military back in, within 6 months of having left, to sort of try and do it better this time, to try and, we're back. This time we're going to send a company instead of a battalion. This time we're going to focus on just the little ink blot and building up the Afghan troops. We're not going to get distracted by big air assaults into the mountains. Mm-hmm. And it has pretty good results, but it's kind of like they're reinventing the wheel that these original Green Berets invented in 2004, right? After all these intervening years of kind of big infantry air assault operations in the mountains. It's kind of once there's a forcing function, and the days of the air assaults are over, and brigades are deploying all slimmed down for advisory stuff, and it's just not an option anymore, then that kind of forces the military to kind of do it probably the way it should have been doing it much, much earlier.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a fine line between letting the Afghans succeed and kind of forcing them to exercise their own, SOPs and stuff like that. There's a fine line between that and leaving them hanging out to dry.
Exactly. That's the really tough, the tough thing. Afghan commanders will take advantage of this too, because they don't want to be left on their own, right?
For sure.
I mean, so what happens in 2011 is the 101st unit that did the pullout goes home. New 25th ID unit comes in, and so this Afghan unit it successfully makes the case to the 25th ID unit. Hey, the 101st did this too soon. We're not ready. And they may have been right. They may have been wrong. But either way, kind of the unit rotation system has an effect here, where a new unit rotates in. It kind of lacks some of the context. It doesn't understand why the previous unit pulled out, and it winds up, recommitting itself.
Well, that's why you're supposed to. I mean, that's why these higher level, these regiments and whatever. Well, so for the Marine Corps, we would send out battalions, and we basically fell under the RCTs, the regimental combat teams, and they would be there for a year, and the battalions would be there for 7 months, and that kind of it was supposed to be a little overlap, so that when the incoming units came in, then they could give them like, hey, here's what we've been dealing with, and these are the people that have actually been dealing with it. I don't know how successful that was, but yeah, it was tough, man. I mean, I was on the last advisor team in Sangin.
Really?
Yeah, and we were like, there were a lot of moments where like I was the JTAC on the team, and there was multiple times where I couldn't get clearance to drop anything in a firefight because the battalion commander for 3-4 was like, hey, we want to make sure the Afghans are using all their systems before we help them. And I'm like, bro, in some of these situations they are. And I'm not going to sit here and explain to you over the radio why I think you should drop this bomb. I would really like it if you did it, though.
Yeah, no, that can be a really tough line to negotiate.
Yeah, and it was tough. And it was also like I remember one time we were at, what was it? I can't remember the name of the FOB we were at. But we were at one of the Afghan outposts, and there was an attack, and all this stuff started happening. They had a patrol out. The company commander got killed along with 6 of the ANA soldiers, and we had the Taliban on the radio. We could hear them, and they're talking about mutilating the bodies and all this shit. And it turns into this fight, and I'm like requesting aircraft, and I'm just getting like denied. Or no, excuse me. I had aircraft on request, and it was coming at a certain time. And the ANA first sergeant was like, "Are you going to help us? Like, what are you guys doing? What are you doing?" And I'm like trying to explain to him, like, "Hey, I got aircraft on the way." And then I remember they were shooting mortars, And I'm like, hey, bro, you got to stop shooting mortars so I can bring these helos in, because obviously you can't bring helicopters in the gun target line of the mortars. And they don't want to stop shooting. And I'm like, look, dude, either you got to stop shooting or the helos aren't coming. And they stopped shooting. And then I got a radio call. It was like, hey, the helos are delayed by like 10 minutes or something like that. And then I have to go back to him and be like, dude, I'm sorry, man. And this whole thing, it was just like, it was a sketchy moment. We had one of the ANA soldiers actually tell us, he was like, hey, there's this building behind us that there's Taliban in. And we're like, we're not even being shot from that direction. Like, what are you talking about? And he was like, no, there's Taliban in there, but give me a 203 so I can shoot grenades into it. And we're like, no, like, what are you talking about? And he goes, either you can help us, or he told the interpreter, he's like, either you guys can help us or we're going to kill you and the Americans.
Yeah.
And that we gave our linguist a pistol after that and told him to watch that dude. And then afterwards, the guy apologized and he was like, hey, it was just a high stress situation. And, like I said, their company commander had been killed. 6 other people had been killed. There were no enemy in that building. After everything kind of calmed down, we saw a bunch of women and kids come out. So it was, but as a guy on the ground, it's a tough spot that I'm getting put into, because I'm here trying to tell these guys that we're here to help you. But imagine this, their leadership is being killed and being mutilated over the radio. And I'm telling them to stop firing, one of the fire support's assets that they have so I can help them. And then I turn around and go, never mind, I can't help you. Sorry for interrupting your, it was just such a tough place to be in.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Marine Corps, something I'll say about the Marine Corps in southwestern Afghanistan and in Anbar too, is that the Marine Corps put a lot more weight into its advising effort than the Army did, in terms of who it selected, who it sent, kind of the incentives that it gave for going and doing these tours. I think there was kind of a lot more talent that the Marine Corps put onto advisor teams in some ways than the Army did. Which is appropriate, because it's like the hardest job you can think of in these wars, right? The situation you just described, I think, is like a perfect encapsulation of the pressures that you're under. Because you're there. As far as the Afghans are concerned, the biggest thing that you're there for is that you're the conduit to high technology and air support. Mm-hmm. And so if you're there and you're not giving that,
it was tough, man.
I remember having a tense moment in Kunar would have been 2013, where I went out and embedded with an ANA unit that no longer had Americans going out and patrol with it. And there was, some minor gunfire being exchanged. And some of the ANA soldiers kind of start looking at me, and my interpreter is like, yeah, they want you to do an airstrike. And I was like, hey, wrong kind of American. I'm just, I can't do that. But from their perspective, they're like, well, there's this American. What are Americans for? What good is this guy if he's not doing the thing Americans do?
Yeah, that's an interesting situation, especially if you were
I've been through a green on blue attack before, so that's something that always kind of made me nervous. Was you try to keep a really close gauge on kind of what are people looking to you for? How are these Afghan troops perceiving you? Do they believe that you're a journalist, or do they what's going on?
Oh yeah, because you could just be some CIA dude pretending to be a journalist out there. Yeah. Did you say you were there for a green on blue attack?
Yeah, in Mosul in 2008. Actually, there were very few green on blue attacks in Iraq ever, but there was one in Mosul. Actually, there was a series of them in Mosul in 2008 to 2009. And one of them I happened to be embedded with the platoon that it happened to.
Damn, man, so we trained extensively for that. I was talking about it on one of the previous podcasts as well. But we trained, it was like there was a lot of pistol shooting from, like, if you were seated at a desk, or you were basically like if you were going to be in your office, those little plywood offices that we would build. It was a lot of stuff like that. And then when we got there, was a lot of like intel briefs with like the LEPs, the law enforcement professionals, and the intel guys about, hey, here's the stuff we've seen. Here's the stuff that, you should be on the lookout for. I remember one time we went out to this patrol base, this Afghan patrol base. And prior to this, the LEP, he was telling us, he's like, look out for the like hearts and arrows or something like that. I can't remember the symbol. I think it was hearts and arrows. He's like, we keep seeing this on like car bombs and VBIDs and stuff like that. They always have this like hearts and arrows symbol spray painted on it. Huh. And it was like an old Taliban thing that was like, I don't know, it was just something like that. And I remember we went to this patrol base, And I think it was me and Joshua Fosberg, who was an infantryman. This was his third deployment, and he was also on the advisor team. And when we got to patrol base, he and I got pulled into some room with a bunch of Afghans. There was like 15 of them in there. And it was just me and him, and the other guys were somewhere else. And I just remember sitting in this room and being like, this is kind of sketchy. Like, we're completely surrounded. And these are all obviously A&A soldiers, but that green on blue is a real thing, and you never know. And we're just having a conversation.
What year was this? Was this 13, 14?
This was in 2013.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
this was the summer of 13. We were there for the fighting season in 13. So, but Josh was the actual, like, that company's enlisted advisor. And I was just the team JTAC. So I was in there with him as like security, something goes weird. He's got somebody else. And I remember just kind of looking around as we're talking and stuff. And I look up on the wall and I see that hearts and arrows thing on the wall. And I'm like, oh, fuck, like, here we go. Like, who are these? Now I'm really nervous, and I don't know. It's such a weird environment as an advisor, and you're put in this kind of weird place. Another example, there was one of the Afghan police got shot in the stomach, and they brought him down to Fob Jackson, which is where we were at, and the medical guys were looking at him. The Afghan medical guys were looking at him. They call us over because we're the advisors, so our corpsmen come over to help their medics and stuff and triage and all this stuff. And props to the guy that got shot in the stomach. I've never seen anybody that calm. He was just laying there, like, super quiet, super calm, hole in the stomach. But then they were like, hey, we need to medevac this guy. We need to get a medevac going. The Afghans were telling us this. So we're radioing it up to our medical people and trying to spin it up. And they're like, negative. The Afghans have to medevac them. And we're like, a medevac for the Afghans is taking a high-back Humvee from Fob Jackson down to Lashkar Gah, which is a pretty long drive over, and they wouldn't let us medevac this guy.
Right.
And I was like, this is crazy.
Doesn't make them any happier with you.
Yeah. No, yeah. Especially, no. When they know you have the capability, it's right there. They see it daily. And if like one of our guys would break his finger, we would medevac him immediately. But this dude's shot in the stomach.
Yeah.
And it's such a weird spot for the troops that are there. And I obviously see how it's a weird spot for the locals too. When you talk to like locals and stuff, what did they see as the vision for Afghanistan? You're saying 2010 timeframe is when you were in the Pech Valley. What was their vision? For the future of their country.
Later years was when I had more access to locals.
Okay.
2010, I still was pretty much seeing things through the U.S. military's eyes.
Okay.
Embeds and stuff. So I would do trips later, like 2013, 2017, where I would try and get more of the Afghan perspective. And I mean, what was their vision? I mean, I think for a lot of people, their vision is they just hope everybody would leave them alone. They just want to survive and have employment. And they would like to sort of not be preyed upon by district officials for bribes and stuff. And so for a lot of people, I think sort of priority number one was we just want kind of fairness, justice, not and not to be kind of preyed upon by all these different actors who come and take different things from us. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, I mean, I think out in rural Afghanistan, I mean, those were some pretty pressing needs that took priority over any kind of, abstraction of form of government or anything.
Yeah, it was very tribal.
Very different, but
yeah, the tribalness of rural areas is I could see how in those areas they're like government, whatever, like this is our government, like this tribal kind of council that we have here. Right. That's all good and everything, but that's a name only really in reality, because we're not connected with that at all.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's for the most part in Kunar anyway. I mean, so Kunar and Nuristan, I mean, they're a place that Nuristan was only incorporated into the Afghan state 120 years ago and converted to Islam forcibly 120 years ago. So, I mean, that's a place up there where, the conception of government is very, very different from kind of the one that the United States is pushing.
For sure.
Really different. I mean, so one of the things that you see over the years is, there are U.S. battalion commanders and company commanders who rotate through who are just so insistent about they want to pin people down on the right side. Are you pro-government or are you pro-Taliban? And that's just not how people see things.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just trying to exist.
Yeah. No, for sure.
One more thing on the green and blues. I mean, I think, 2010, the green on blues hadn't really started so much in Afghanistan, but by 2013, I mean, they were so huge. I think it was either 2012 or 2013 was the year that 20% of ISAF fatalities were in green on blues. And, I mean, from the Taliban's perspective, it was a perfect tactic. And I think it's really hard. I don't think we even know in retrospect, or probably will ever know, what proportion of green on blues were kind of, spontaneous things that resulted from just tensions between young Americans and young Afghans who have such completely different sort of cultures and worldviews, and just some little thing sparked something, versus how many were people who were put up to it by the Taliban and kind of remote controlled by the Taliban, versus how much were actual Taliban operatives who infiltrated. But I mean, from the Taliban's perspective, it's this perfect thing because it breaks the bond that is necessary. This kind of the partnership advisor-advisee bond, and it's like it's the perfect way of kind of severing that tie. I mean, I remember after the green on blue in Mosul in 2008, I remember the battalion commander or cavalry squadron commander kind of coming out and telling everybody, hey, the important thing is nothing about how we deal with our Iraqi partners changes as a result of this. Because if anything that we do about how we deal with our Iraqi partners changes, then the people who put this guy up to it have achieved their objective. But then there was a battalion commander on the other side of the city who, it wasn't even his guys who had been killed in the green on blue, but who very much was like, hey, we're building walls on the outposts now in between our side and their side, and kind of giving the enemy what they want. I mean, and that's one of the toughest balances in these wars has been kind of force protection versus mission accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
And I think the harder and harder it gets to discern what the mission is and what mission accomplishment would look like, the harder and harder it gets to justify taking bigger risks, and making sacrifices on the force protection side.
Yeah, for sure. Because you got to explain. I mean, these battalion commanders, like, let's say that guy had someone killed in the insider attack, but he's like, hey, we're not changing anything. And then someone else gets killed. People are going to be like, well, why the hell didn't you change anything? This is obviously an issue. But again, it's like you're saying, it's a fine line. People that are like, a lot of people are making judgment about calls that are being made in country without fully understanding anything that's happening. You know, and that's why guys like you are important. Obviously, you're supposed to bring that full picture back to the people and let them see it. But I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I mean, I guess what are your thoughts on the coverage of the wars over the last 20 years? Do you think that I mean, obviously this is a general question. There's good and bad to it, but overall, do you think that the wars were covered fairly and accurately, or do you think a lot of outlets used it as just one more, political beating stick against whatever politician they wanted to, beat up?
So, I mean, this sort of is a bigger question about kind of how you consume news.
That's true.
I mean, I don't. So. I mean, when I hear this question, I mean, what I think of is people who covered the wars on the ground for newspapers and stuff like that. But of course, that's only a small segment of what people are actually consuming about the wars. They're also consuming, stuff by opinion writers, which are also journalists. But like, to me, like when I'm thinking about it, like that's just it's like a different species. That's as different to me as like a sailor on a carrier is from an infantryman. But from the perspective of a lot of Americans, I think it's hard. It gets hard to tease out the difference between, you're not paying attention to the byline of the article and following certain reporters. I don't really ever watch TV news. So that's not part of how I think about it. But I think there has been some really fantastic coverage over the years by a lot of people that I know, including by veterans. I mean, there are some very good reporters on this beat, who had previously fought in the wars.
I think when we talk about journalists and stuff, the issue that a lot of service members have would be like, what was that general who was talking? It wasn't even him. It was like his aide mentioned something to a Rolling Stone reporter, and it got misreported that he said it, and then he ended up getting fired from being in charge of Afghanistan, and like a whole thing about something that didn't even really occur or wasn't even a big deal, but some reporter got it wrong. And I think those kind of stories really.
Well, you're talking about the McChrystal affair.
McChrystal.
I don't know that he got anything wrong. I mean, I think there was, McChrystal had some aides who were saying some kind of wild stuff.
But I think it was the wild stuff was attributed to him though, and not his aides. If I'm remembering it, I could be wrong. I'd
have to go back and read the article. But I mean, it's especially
But that's the fear, right? That some journalist is going to come in.
I remember actually being in Sangin when that happened.
Oh, really?
It's funny you say this because I remember, this was sort of like before there were a lot of smartphones and stuff. And I remember being out at, what was the outpost called? I think it was called Airport Lounge was the name of this little patrol base because there was like this weird statue of an airplane on the top of this old compound. And so I've been out there for, a week or something maybe. And I came back to Fob Jackson and I had a kind of sit down with the British battalion commander there. And he made a joke about like, well, don't Rolling Stone me. And I had no idea what he's talking about because this had happened while I was out at the little outpost. I just kind of like laughed and went along with the interview. And it was only later that I realized that I, went and checked my email and saw like, oh, McChrystal got summoned home and fired over this story.
Over these comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's probably a lot we'll never know about exactly the backstory of that story. But I mean, probably one part of it is that McChrystal was a guy who came from JSOC world and wasn't used to, and so were many of his aides.
Yeah.
And weren't used to kind of having to think about what they said around a reporter. And then they made kind of a spur of the moment decision to, let this guy come along on this long trip and everything. And it was unusual.
Yeah, it is what it is, I guess. I mean, that's the job. What do you think about, like, you've covered the military for years, and there's obviously activist journalists out there that don't like the military. There's obviously citizens out there that don't like the military. You as a neutral observer, I'm not asking if you like the military or not.
Yeah.
But what do you think about how the military has handled itself in these different conflicts that you've observed?
Yeah, I mean, the military is not monolithic, right? I mean, so how has the military handled these conflicts is a really hard question. I think there are. How have infantry NCOs handled the conflict versus how have generals handled the conflict? How have generals who were generals when the conflict started versus how have guys who rose to being generals from being captains and majors when the conflict started?
Yeah.
There's a huge variability, and there's a lot of both credit and blame to be shared between both the military and the civilian government that sent them to wars and continued sending them to wars for years and years and years. And that, I think if we kind of try and pin it all on one or the other, say, oh, well, the military failed in the wars that it was sent to fight, or, oh, the civilian government, stabbed them in the back by sending them into unwinnable wars. I mean, there's neither of those is the full story.
For sure.
It's just more complicated than that. I have a tremendous amount of affection and admiration for the military. I think, I know the Army and the Marine Corps much better than I know the Navy and the Air Force. But I mean, some of the most interesting and happiest times of my life have been, around young American soldiers who were in really difficult situations, trying to do the best with what they had, the resources they had, the information they had, the preparation they had, and doing really, really hard jobs. So, I mean, I have tremendous admiration for that. Where I think the military has often fallen short is in everything from how it resources and prioritizes kind of like the big war of the infantry fight versus the advisor war, prioritizing one at the expense of the other, to how it passes down lessons, the ways that kind of, different units have to keep relearning the same lessons over and over and over again, that predecessor units have learned before them. I mean, that's where kind of my criticism, I guess, would come in.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of service members would agree with you as well. I've mentioned many times on the podcast before about there's always an after action review after every deployment, after every like major exercise and stuff like that. But the thing about those is the battalion commander doesn't want to look bad. Right. So that after action review is skewed in that manner where his staff is like, look how awesome we are. We $12 billion budget, blah, blah, blah. We did this. We had this much ammo that was whatever, and it's just all these like cool words that make it sound super awesome. And there's no real like lesson. The real, where the rubber meets the road kind of lessons don't always make it out. It's just it's something I've criticized multiple times. I'm like, look, we got to be hard on ourselves, and that's the only way we get better is by being like, hey, look, Alpha Company was really good at this, but didn't do very well at this. It's because their guys need to work on this task, or, they need to be better at this. So
a related observation that I would have is that I think even when things went wrong and there was an outside investigation, so for example, the Battle of Wanat in the Pech in 2008, where 9 paratroopers were killed, and kind of people had sort of forgotten about Afghanistan during the Iraq surge, and it became this big deal, and there was this big CENTCOM investigation into sort of how did this happen, and it's it's a very critical investigation. It winds up recommending charges of dereliction of duty for the company, brigade, and battalion commanders, including a company commander who earned a Silver Star during the firefight.
Oh, shit.
Essentially for allowing the battle to happen in the first place. But what this investigation focuses on is it focuses very, very heavily on the days and weeks leading up to the battle immediately before it, and kind of the decisions that were made immediately before it. And what it doesn't go into is kind of the bigger story of how that unit and those commanders were put in that position by their predecessors, by the CIA officers at the Sadabad base who influenced their predecessors' decisions. It misses a lot of sort of the bigger picture of why things went wrong in Afghanistan more generally. I mean, I think because in that case there kind of was the opposite. There was like a rush to blame.
Yeah.
It was, whose fault is it that 9 Americans were killed by these scraggly guerrillas in the middle of nowhere in a place that we can't even pronounce, right? Yeah. And in that case, I think there was too much of a rush to blame somebody. When kind of the blame is probably, part of it is to a very skillful enemy that was able to pull that attack off. But a lot more of it has to do with decisions that were made before that unit ever reached Afghanistan. And the situation that they were put in, having outposts in the Waigal Valley that they could only resupply by helicopter, and sort of trying to figure out how they were going to pare that back and what they were going to do.
Yeah, that's true. That's 100% true. Like the larger context, like how this firefight shouldn't have happened, but how did we lead up and just even become like a possibility that it could happen? Yeah, I think you're right, and I do think sometimes commanders are thrown under the bus because something becomes a news story, and the government or the military looks at it and goes, "Hey, we got to do something," or the public is going to be upset. So they start throwing.
Wanat was one of those cases. The division commander was a guy named Jeff Schlosser, and he was never going to suffer any consequences as a result of Wanat. It was the guys below him, the brigade, battalion, and company commanders that were kind of being investigated. But he was incredibly frustrated by the whole thing. He saw it as kind of like a witch hunt. There's a quote that he gave that really stuck with me. That there's a Marine 3-star general who comes in and is doing the investigation, and this guy has never been in Afghanistan. He has extensive Iraq experience, but he's never been in Afghanistan. And it's very clear during the investigation that there's a lot of nuance that he's just kind of missing. He gets hung up on different things. He gets hung up on there should have been a predator overhead, not understanding that the kind of vegetation that's up there, a predator overhead would not have spotted this, in this kind of thick forest, the way things happened. He just gets hung up on the wrong things. And the division commander Schlosser, he tells Natansky, the investigating general, this thing. He says, this is not a ship running aground. This is a living, breathing, flexible enemy that knows the terrain better than we do. And that has always kind of stuck with me. When I think about the decisions that officers had to make in these kinds of wars, and thinking about kind of who is to blame in any situation. I think because of some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, the unavailability of the Taliban to talk about their side of things until recently, it's often very easy to think of it as just kind of, this was a U.S. military that was just inserted into a difficult place and had to do what it could, and not think about, well, there are two sides to this. Everything that the U.S. military does, the enemy adapts to. And they're pretty good at it.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. With all these investigations and stuff that have happened over the years of the wars and stuff, what really surprised a lot of people is after the whole pullout of Afghanistan, the investigations occurred, but there was nothing that came of it. And even actually the administration rejected the military's investigation results, which was pretty wild. What were you surprised by the pullout, or not necessarily by the pullout, but Were you surprised that the country fell as quickly as it did?
I was surprised that it fell as quickly as it did. I mean, in my mind, my kind of worst case scenario that I was thinking through that I thought was likely was I thought, well, okay, Kandahar will fall in 2021. And then in next year, 2022, then we'll start thinking about the security of Kabul. So I was obviously totally wrong about that. I was surprised.
To be honest, I wasn't. After being an advisor and being, two deployments to Afghanistan, it was pretty well known that there was a lot of corruption within the ANA, within their military. Their officers weren't paying their guys. Their officers had fake soldiers on their rolls to get extra money. Their officers bought their own positions. Soldiers were out at these outposts like Sangin and stuff without enough ammo, without enough food. And it's like, how can we expect these guys to fight when we're not even giving them full rations or they don't even have 5 magazines of ammo? What kind of fight are they really going to put up?
I guess the thing that made me think they would last longer, like I didn't think they were going to last a lot longer, but I thought it was going to last another year or two, was during the post February 2020 period, during the Doha deal. I mean, so much of the U.S. support had already gone away, right? The U.S. forces that were still there were really doing so little by that point that I thought kind of the way the Afghan army was performing in 2020 and the opening months of 2021 would be more of a preview of the way they would kind of continue to perform, and so that the gains would be slower. The Taliban they were obviously gaining ground. They were gaining ground every fighting season. It was not going in the right direction. It was going in the wrong direction.
For sure.
But I thought, my guess based on their past behavior was they're going to start going for provincial capitals. Yeah. And basically, that's what's going to happen once there's no U.S. air power around, is provincial capitals that previously would fall and be retaken. They just do a few provincial capitals at once. They'll take a few provincial capitals at once, and they're going to run around. I mean, they were overstretching the kind of. I think one of the biggest problems with the Afghan security forces, and this is one that the United States bears a lot of responsibility for, is over the years. We made the Afghan security forces so big in the surge era that then we felt it necessary to kind of make this more distilled, smaller, better form of them with the commandos and all these various special forces organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think there was this phenomenon where as you built more and more of those organizations and made them bigger and bigger, they sucked up all the talent that existed in the regular ANA and left this kind of very brittle force where any NCO, any young officer who was anything and had kind of ambition was going to jump ship to the commandos the first chance that they got. And so you have this, this sort of army that's not capable of anything more than static defense of little patrol bases. And then you have this other army that that races around the country all the time, responding to different crises. Mm-hmm. And that's no way to run an army, but that's something that we imparted on them. And kind of with our own sort of dual structure where we always had conventional forces fighting one war in Afghanistan and special operations forces fighting another war in Afghanistan. And our special operations forces didn't want anything to do with the regular Afghan army. And they were much more interested in kind of training smaller, better, partner forces for themselves. I think that is a big factor in kind of how, among many big factors.
Yeah.
In how the Afghan army collapsed.
Yeah, for sure. I guess for me, it wasn't as big of a surprise because, like I said, we were the last advisor team in Sangin, and then I think within 2 years, Sangin was taken over by the Taliban. The district center was taken over, and I remember it was so not like depressing, but it was sad to see like these YouTube videos of the Sangin Bazaar completely like deserted and like destroyed and stuff. When we used to cruise through there and it was like chaos because it was just so many people out shopping and doing stuff. Obviously there were still issues at the time. I remember a moped that had an IED attached to it that went off in the bazaar and shit like that. But there was still like commerce and stuff, and it just went to just barren, it looked horrible and it was kind of tough to see. So seeing that not long after we left, I was like, well, I think that's probably how the whole country's what's going to happen with the entire country. And then when we started pulling out, I guess that's kind of where it was. I wasn't surprised. I was just like, man, what a waste.
You'd seen kind of the worst case scenario. There's hardly anywhere like Sangin. That's an extreme end of the spectrum.
Sangin is an interesting spot. You were there with the British?
Yeah.
So this was before the Marines took over that area then?
Yeah, so this was the summer of 2010, and 3-7 was just arriving and sort of starting to take over parts of the AO, but it wasn't until the fall after I had left. So basically the unit that I embedded with was the last of the British battalions to go to Sangin.
What an interesting time to have been there.
It was very interesting. And then, when they left, they handed things over to 3-5.
And when you, so when you were there, when they switched from the British running the area to the Americans, did you just stay? Were you embedded with the Americans?
No,
then,
so I was only there. It was for a few weeks early in the summer with the British battalion. So I never went back to Sangin. I never went back and saw it in the U.S. Marine days. Man,
that would have been interesting to see how both units kind of operated, because obviously us going in there, we heard. People, they were like, hey, the British put out too many outposts. They only had enough people to man the outposts. They couldn't even do security patrols to keep people away from them. So they were
which is true. I mean, that matches with my observation of, this British Royal Marine Commando Battalion had, I think it was 21, 22 outposts that it was manning, which is double the number that the U.S. ever had in the Pech Valley. And those ones were stretched pretty small at the height of things. I mean, so I remember this place, Airport Lounge. I remember being there, and it was what they called a troop. I mean, their version of a platoon. But it was a very understrength platoon that was manning this outpost. I mean, it was like 20 Royal Marines at this outpost, a bunch of A&A. And I mean, they genuinely were not able to secure their own outpost perimeter. I mean, to the extent that one night somebody got up close and threw a grenade over the perimeter and killed a Marine inside. Which that was surprising to me.
were the IED threats real bad then as well?
It was very, very severe. I mean, I think by 2009 already, Sangin was sort of the pressure plate IED capital of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And by 2010, so of all the battalions that took all the heaviest losses in the Afghan war for like single tour deployments, one of them was an Army battalion up in the Pech. Actually, a couple of Army battalions up in the Pech. But they took him over 15 and 16 month deployments. And then the other top ones are all, 3-5 in Sangin, and then 2 rifles and 3 rifles. The two of the British battalions that were there before 3-5, which obviously took them in 6-7 month tours.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the place. Sangin was like a minefield. I mean, it was unbelievable. And that's something I hope someone writes a book kind of about Sangin the way I did about the Pech, because especially with the benefit of being able to talk to the Taliban now, I still don't understand exactly what the importance of Sangin was. So much more so than other districts in Helmand.
Yeah.
Obviously, it had to do with the drug war. It had to do with tribal competition between 2 tribes that one had sort of sided with the government, one had sided with the Taliban. But there was something about Sangin that just, they committed an unbelievable amount of IED resources to it.
It was crazy. 611, the main road going, for those that don't know, it's the north-south main running road through Sangin, goes north up to the dam. What was the name of the dam? Kajaki Dam. Yeah, and one of the big pushes while we were there was to get 611 paved to decrease the amount of IEDs, because one of the major goals for the U.S., and I don't think it ever happened, was to get that route paved and fix the dam so that it could actually provide consistent power to Helmand Valley. Right. But the Taliban were completely against that. They were totally against having consistent, electricity and stuff for the Helmand Valley. So I don't know. It was definitely an interesting place. It was definitely a minefield. Not so much when I was there. I mean, it was still pretty bad. Luckily, none of our guys ever stepped on one, or we never hit one. Our Afghans did, obviously. But when 3-5 and them were there, for sure a minefield. I don't know if you've ever read. Bing West wrote a book called 1 Million Steps.
I have, yeah, and I know Bing, and yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's cool. I met him once when I was in Marja in 2011 with 3-6. He came through.
Were you with 3-6 at one point?
Yeah, I was the fires chief for 3-6.
Oh, gotcha. So 3-6 actually comes up in my book, because 3-6 did an Eastern Afghanistan deployment in 2004. Where they had a company that was up in Kunar in the Pech.
That's I'm gonna have to check that out, because I've always, everyone in the Marine Corps, especially, everyone knows about like Afghanistan post the surge, but for that 2002 to 2010 period,
Yeah.
There's not a lot. There's only small elements going there. Not many guys. Everybody else was going to Iraq, and that was the focus.
Exactly.
There's
Yeah,
so
sort
much
of a
stuff.
forgotten chapter in some ways. I mean, because it was in the Afghan East. I mean, there was 3-6, and then all the battalions of 3rd Marines rotated through in 04 and 05, and there was this one battalion rotation that was just attached to the army, not part of a MAGTF or anything, up in northeastern Afghanistan. And I talked to a lot of those 3rd Marines guys for the book, a lot of the 3-6 guys for the book, the battalion commanders, company commanders, platoon sergeants, guys like that. And then the other one is, the Marines for years, they sourced out of Okinawa and Hawaii. They sourced all the advisors for the Northeast, the ANA, APT advisors, even though the Army owned the AOs. So in the Pech, you'd go up there and it was, an Army battalion living there, but there would be little teams of like 2 or 3 Marines that were the ANA advisors, and they were very good at it.
Yeah. I will say, I mean, I enjoyed the advisor training that we did in the Marine Corps. Obviously, as you're going through it, you're like, oh, this is stupid, or this could be better. But then when you look at it, you're like, we're actually pretty good at it. We actually did a pretty good job of covering, I don't know.
One guy that I remember I interviewed, this guy named Patrick Byron, who had been the Marine officer who had been the team chief at FOB Blessing in the Pech at one point. And his dad had been a Covan advisor to the Vietnamese Marine Corps in Vietnam. And he had such an interesting perspective, kind of sharing. It was a totally different animal, the way the Marine Corps and the Army advised in Vietnam. It was much more, you're a member of the unit. You wear their uniform, you live with them, you don't have your own separate vehicles or anything like that. Very different from kind of the Iraq, Afghanistan era approach.
Yeah. And they tried to, you're right. For people that don't, what do they call it? It wasn't the Village Stability Program. That was in Afghanistan. It was CAP, I think. Combined. No.
So, yes, that was one iteration of it with the Marine Corps, was the Combined Action Program in Vietnam. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember reading about that and thinking like, wow, that's really cool. They're like living in the villages. They're part of not.
Bing West wrote. Bing West did that as a young Marine junior officer. He wrote a book about it called The Village.
I think that's the book I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
That's got to be the book I'm thinking about. Yeah, really good stuff, man. Hey, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we should probably do one some other time and talk about, more about some of these other like early Afghan days, like, this prior to the surge in 2006, if you can, or whatever. I do want to give you an opportunity to like promote your book. So where can people find your book? Where can people find all your stuff at?
Yeah, so the book should be anywhere books are sold, kind of thing. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, just ask them and they'll get it. And if not, it's obviously Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, all those places have it. It's called The Hardest Place, the American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pech Valley. And the idea was, tell a story of 20 years of war in one small place, because telling the story of 20 years of war in the whole country was too much and impossible. And so I wanted to kind of do a little focused look at one area. And yeah, it should be, it's the kind of, I think if you served in the military, it'll be a good read. There won't be any terms that will be like unfamiliar to everybody. It's meant to be accessible to anyone. So the most gratifying feedback that I ever get about it is when guys tell me that they've given a copy to their kid or their wife or their dad, to kind of help explain the war that they fought in. But yeah, check it out. I've also I'm on Twitter at Wesley S. Morgan. I've got my pinned tweet is a thread of photos of the Pech that guys shared with me as I was reporting it, because there's only room for like 20, 30 photos in the book in the little photo insert. But guys shared so many with me. There's so much. So if you want to get a look at the place, Instagram, same thing, Wesley S. Morgan. I'm not so active on there, but I do share stuff periodically.
That's good stuff, man. My buddy Andrew DeMauro read the book and reached out to me. He was like, dude, you got to have this guy on. He's like, super interesting book. I think he said he reached out to you and talked to you a little bit about it as well.
Awesome.
So that's where that led to this, and I haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, but I'm going to read that. I'm going to take a look, and I'd love to have you on some other time, and we can set that up in the future.
Sure.
For everybody out there, you can check out my stuff, jkramergraphics.com, on Instagram at Former Action Guys and at Former Action News. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to go over to Patreon at Former Action Guys there, and leave a donation. Help support the show. That's how I got this new mic, my first time using it. So thanks.
Well, thanks for having me on, especially as a not former action guy myself, just one who was hung around and wrote about it.
I don't know, man. I think an Embed reporter counts.